my dears, this video is about to be really nerdy, and I'm really excited for it. Also, audio description for folks who need it. I am a white person in their early 20s with brownish blondish hair that's curly and currently in pigtails, which works better in my head and I don't know how I feel about them, so do let me know if I should repeat this look. I'm currently wearing a navy blue top that's kind of sailor cut with like the white sailor stripe around it, and I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf that has books on it and some photos of the wall behind me. So there you go. Now, about a year or so ago, I made a video called Neurodiversity and Literature, where we talked about various literary tropes that are effectively autistic people, and then various aphasias and neurological speech differences that are part of neurodiversity that are likely responsible for many of the types of writing that we typically see in literature. I'm hating the pigtails more as time goes on. Anyway, today we are going to kind of recap those things and add a few more because I'm a psychologist and a linguist, and this is precisely the cross-section of those two things, and it brings me a lot of joy. So one of the ways that I most quickly recognize other neurodivergent people is by their communication style. We just speak differently, and it's always been kind of difficult for me to explain what specifically about it is different. But I found it, and now we're going to be nerds about it. And I don't think that these things either need or should be pathologized unless they're like causing issues for people, which often they don't. But in the sense of, hey, these are cool, now we have words to describe things that already exist, I think that they're important and it's really cool, and that's why we're talking about it today. Also because I know a handful of people that are trying to authentically write autistic characters and aren't sure how to get that little bit of life into it to make it sound natural, so by dissecting typical speech patterns here, maybe it'll make your writing easier. I hope. It's also important to mention before we get into this that neurotypicality and neurodivergency, or autistic and non-autistic, are not explicit, cut and dry categories that we often think of them to be. Autism is not a monolith experience, and I'm also firmly of the belief that autism does not exist to begin with. It is just an arbitrary category created to place the blame of struggling on the individual rather than acknowledge that it's actually a societal issue that we refuse to fix because we don't like making things accessible. So if you're not autistic and you speak in these speech patterns, or you are autistic and you don't, do not panic. Nothing is real, and this is just based on generally common patterns that are not neurotype exclusive. Did my neighbor decide to start doing construction right now? This video... So with that, we're going to start by talking about language development, not in like the creation of a new language, but in the sense of like when you're a baby and you are learning language. And there are two types of speech development. The most typical type, and the one that education is therefore catered towards, is analytic language development and processing. So that is you learn C, and then you learn C spot, followed by C spot run. That kind of thing. You learn each individual piece and you learn how to put all of them together, and that's how you construct language. The second type, the one that we are going to talk about, is Gestalt language development and processing. And research has shown that almost all autistics are Gestalt processors. Though it's important to note that not all Gestalt language processors are autistic. Also, autism isn't real. I digress. When you see the word Gestalt in psychology, it's usually referring to something being kind of all-encompassing, sort of, kind of like how you perceive the whole rather than the sum of its parts. And it's really hard to explain further than that because there's no direct translation. But in my brain, this is about to be an interesting analogy. Gestalt things feel like the theoretical equivalent of taking a lump of spaghetti and chucking it all at the wall at the same time to see what sticks, while analytic would be like putting up each individual strand of spaghetti to stick on the wall one at a time. Don't ask me why that's the analogy that my brain comes up with, but it is. So now it's in your brain too, and you're welcome. Now, I think that it's really fascinating that Gestalt language processing is how autistic people process language, because when you think of your typical portrayals of autistic speech in the media, it's usually very methodical, and there are 19 cows in the field, 15 of which are black and white, and 4 of which are brown and white. There's a village in the distance which has 31 visible houses. I'm sorry, I'm studying Curious Incident right now. Sorry. But because of this, you would want to think that, if anything, autistic people would see language in an analytic sense. Logically. But no. So what does Gestalt language processing look like? It looks like repeating long scripts from things like books, movies, songs, etc. after a delay. If it's directly after, that's echolalia. That's a different thing. We're gonna talk about that in a wee bit. Just hold up. And it also involves stuck single words that the person knows where to put and how to label things with said word, but they're not able to build on those words or understand their much larger meaning and context. They will often say long strings of unintelligible language that has a conversational intonation but otherwise makes absolutely no sense. This is because they have things that they want to say that they're not motorically able to do yet, usually involving script repeating. It also involves using and being drawn to language that is rich in intonation and emotion. Kind of think about how Anne of Green Gables season describes her world. That. It also involves pronoun reversal because they will speak of themselves in the same way that they've heard other people speak of them, because scripting, so they may call themselves you or use their name to refer to themselves, for example. Also, a big part of this can be replaying media clips over and over and over again, often used as a form of communication, and things like AAC are very well implemented but not necessarily making progress because AAC is not made typically with Gestalt language processors in mind. That does not mean that you can't make new ones, but it's very hilarious to me that it doesn't do that because a really huge chunk of the target audience for AAC is a Gestalt language processor. But anyway, all the things that I read in Gestalt language processing were specifically about how children develop and process language. And that's because it's typically talked about in an early intervention setting and not a I want to learn more about autistic language processing just for funsies kind of way, like I want to learn these things. So when it comes to adulthood, many of these things are going to lessen or shift or change simply because people grow and change over time. That is how life works. So in our discussion of different language patterns and such, I'm going to try to reframe as many of those things through the lens of not children, because I'm very much not a child. I look like one with the pigtails. But if you find yourself comparing autistic communication to toddler communication after the things that I say, know that it's probably more to do with the fact that this stuff is mostly researched in analyzing the comparisons of analytic and Gestalt toddler communication, not that all autistic people speak like toddlers. Please, let's not continue traditions of infantilizing us. We don't want to see it. Even though I'm doing that with a pigtail. Anyway, okay, yeah. Also, we've talked about a handful of these before, my neurodiversity and literature video. Today we're going to talk about those more in depth, and also there are significantly more things like that that I found when I was looking for just speech patterns and not speech patterns in relation to literature tropes. Amazing how one improves in their research and writing and whatnot in just a year of time working on this channel. Truly astounds me. I'm really proud of myself. But anyway, we're going to talk about speech patterns and speech disorders first, then prosody, which is tone and pitch and volume and all that good stuff, and then we're gonna have a discussion of the literary autism voice, and hopefully by then you will be able to understand what seems kind of wrong and off with it. Also, when trying to figure out what order to tell you these things in, I opted to go in the order of these things are similar to each other or overlap, rather than speech patterns versus speech errors versus speech tendencies, because that made more sense in my brain, and maybe it will in yours. Or maybe it won't, but I'm in charge of the video, and you're just watching it, so that's funky. Anyway, the first thing is a speech pattern. It is intermittent speech, and this is also often called selective mutism. That's a technical diagnosis, and it's when sometimes you can speak and sometimes you can't. It is very common for autistics when they get really overwhelmed or exhausted to lose the ability to speak, whether they're not able to do the motor bit of speaking physically because of being overwhelmed or whatever, or their brain can no longer process words. We talked about this in my AAC video. You can check it out up here. The next one is unreliable speech. This is when things come out of our face that we don't mean to say or do not mean. For example, if somebody looked at my skirt and I went, "Oh, did you make that yourself?" Sometimes I glitch and I just say, "Yeah, I did." Even though, no, I have never made one of my skirts, but I cannot come up with the words in order to fix that. So then I'm caught in an awkward lie that only really I know is a lie, and I could just fake it and move on, but it's a whole panic moment, which usually makes me lose the ability to further speak in order to fix the situation because I get anxious. It's wild. This is pretty much the only time that I lie. It is completely and totally by accident, and I forget where I initially read about this, but it made me feel a whole lot better once I did know about it, because I was like, oh, it's not on purpose. Semantic or verbal paraphasia is a type of aphasia, speech error usually related to processing, where a person might call an apple an orange, or a dog a cat. Categorically, they're not really wrong, but they're also not right. Anomic aphasia is the one that you see most often, or at least I see most often, because most of my close friends and also a lot of my close relatives have some form of this. But basically it's categorized by word retrieval failures, most commonly with nouns and verbs. So like, you know that thing when you're learning a new language and you don't know the word for a thing, so you try to weirdly describe your way all the way around it so that other people know what you're talking about without having to say the word because you don't know what the word is? So anomic aphasia is that, but in your natural fluent language. Some of my more notable examples include calling a goose a Hong Kong dog, which isn't wrong, and a lid a cup hat, which is, again, not wrong technically. Somebody I know has called cars the Go Place box vroom vroom, candy canes Jesus sticks, and food clothes for the stomach, and yes, I do keep a running list of these in my phone. In literature, for me, this honestly explains why metaphors exist in general, because I like to think that the first metaphor was just a result of somebody having terrible noun recall, and then everybody thought it was so pretty and beautiful and creative that they just kept rolling with it, and then it became a common literary device. Who knows? Anyway, next is insufficient speech. This is when we want to say all of our thoughts, but they're not conveyed because the proper words and things that we want to say don't come out of our faces. Like, we cannot process it in a way that would put it into proper words to then be able to explain properly what we are thinking, and it can be so infuriating because it feels like you're constipated, but in your brain. Then we have contiguity disorder. This is categorized by word heaps in the sense that there's no grammatical structure. It's just the words that you can think of. So, like, instead of trying to be like, hey, my shoes are hurting, but I'm stuck and I cannot untie them, but I need to take them off because they hurt and it's making me overwhelmed, a person would just instead go, feet stuck, shoe, ow, help. This also kind of relates to a type of poetry, which I think is cool, and I really meant to make this video separate from a literary analysis video, but I can't do it. It just can't. I'll include a really cool article by Roman Jacobson in the description for you if you're interested. It's kind of about this. But anyway, the next one is actually pretty similar to that one, and it is called cluttering. It's a speech disorder, and this is when the speaker speaks at a rate that is simply too fast for their system to handle. So to the listener, this is going to sound way too fast. Often the sounds of words run together, or sounds and syllables might be deleted or switched up. There are excessive repetitions of phrases, filler words, and revisions of ideas, and pauses in places where they would not naturally or grammatically be expected to be. In case you haven't noticed, this is how I naturally speak. I have this one. It's gotten a lot better over time simply because I do a lot of public speaking now, so things come out more clearly than they used to. But one of the major reasons that I script my videos is to avoid excessive cluttering that may make absolutely no sense to you guys, and I still definitely make no sense. Because I still talk excessively fast, and I know, and I can't stop, and I'm really sorry. That's why I caption everything that I make. And when it comes to words, my brain just runs at extra speed. So I literally watch YouTube videos at 1.5 speed regularly, so even the way that I speak in these videos is slow for my brain. Anyway, next we have neologistic paraphasia, also referred to as neologisms and neologisms. I don't know about that. This is the use of non-real words in place of an intended word, typically words that don't sound at all similar to the intended word and have no meaning in the user's language. So examples of this would be calling a toothbrush a slunker, or a shirt a glimbop. Then we have idiosyncratic speech. This is another speech disorder that's really common. It's using a word or expression to refer to something that's unrelated or irrelevant. Frankly, I feel like this in a way has become a sort of trend in internet speak, and it's always hilarious. This is my kind of humor and I love it. But also it's another very clearly autistic example, which is using lines from a movie, for example, as a form of communication. Next is phonemic paraphasia. This is when a sound substitution is made, like teflon or bean greens. Some more recent ones in my household include push happies and shimnabops. Stuttering, I think we all know what stuttering is at this point. It happens when a person is clear on the words that they would like to say, but they physically struggle to get the words out of their mouth. A stutter can be repeated sounds like dog, or repeated syllables like dog, or prolonging sounds like dog, and becoming stuck or blocked on a sound like dog. Atypical disfluency, which is thought to be a very similar mechanism to the action of a stutter, but research into this one is pretty new, so that's not confirmed yet, is when a person has easy repetitions or prolongations of the sounds at the end of the words, like lunch, or they insert a sound in the middle of the word, like tohoy, instead of toy. And when I was little, I used to always overemphasize the ch sounds at the end of words, and it used to be a running joke in my household, but I hope that everybody's forgotten at this point. Maybe? I for sure did this all the time until people began to tease me about it, and I very distinctly remember in kindergarten, like, trying to train myself out of it. Also, as I said in my literature video, I pretty distinctly remember having read or having a discussion or discussing a reading about disorders that characterize different meters of speech and therefore could have been a precursor to metered poetry like iambic pentameter and metered writing. But I cannot find the article to save my life, and I don't want to just name a thing without having a source. But it does make logical sense, but that doesn't mean that it's true. I would like it to exist, so if you have any leads on that, do let me know. I really want to know more about that. Now our next section is prosody. That's tone, rhythm, and stress patterns of speech. And very probably some of these things probably would have fit into the last category of this video instead of this one. I'm just now realizing this. My research for this was a different research paper than the rest of the things, so we're going to pretend it's fine. The research paper I read, I'll link in the description for you, talked about how there's a significant link between prosodic skills, prosodic? We're going to say prosodic, that sounds right. Prosodic skills and executive functions like divided attention, working memory, and several others. And since ADHD is categorized explicitly by errors in executive functioning and autism is categorized by slightly different mostly errors in executive functioning. The fact that autistic people are known to speak oddly in ways that are often described as, quote, machine-like, monotonic, or sing-song really makes a lot of sense. And why are prosodic differences a problem, you may ask? Well, because in language, culturally, the way speech rises and falls indicates emotional state. It's involved in the stress and emphasis of certain words, which conveys sarcasm and humor, and it helps to identify whether speech is used to express a general observation or a command or a question, which would explain why there is a fundamental communication difference and subsequent communication error and issue between people with prosodic differences and people with your typical prosody. So this study analyzed a couple studies with subjective ratings of prosody in autistic individuals, subjective meaning that it wasn't based on like a quantifiable evidence like numbers and stuff like that, but that does not mean that it's not just as valid as an objective thing is. And it found that autistic people tended to show flatter intonation, I put that in quotes, have deficits in the use of pitch and volume control, deficiencies in vocal quality, whatever that means, use of atypical stress patterns, had a lower frequency of proper speech expressions, and had a greater proportion of syllables with atypical phonation. Studies based on objective ratings found that autistic people actually have a larger pitch range in speech, but the peaks in sentences were misplaced, and the amplitude of those peaks was flatter, which basically means that while they had a greater range of pitch, they were really high and really low in pitch all the time, they weren't evenly jumping between those pitches as a non-autistic person would do. It was instead more flat across the board, so it went more like this rather than like this, if that makes sense. It also found that speech patterns were auditorially more similar to how a mother would speak to a child than a typical adult speaking to another adult, which at first made me kind of annoyed because infantilization, but then when they explained their theory as to why this is, it actually really does check out. When you have errors in executive functioning, that causes minor motor mechanism errors and deficits, though I hate the word deficit, we're gonna roll with it right now, which makes it harder to control pitch and volume and tonal quality. And then on top of that, autistic people are significantly more likely to have auditory processing disorders, which would then add to this issue. So I would argue that the reason that we often speak in the way that a mother would speak to a child is more to do with the executive functioning issues and the processing issues than it has to do with the cultural, you're a baby, if that makes any sense. Good lord. Now, as you probably know, I have a series of shorts on here and reels on Instagram where I review autistic representation in media, also disability and also amnesia, but that's a later discussion. And when I do so, I usually look up the opinions of other autistic people as well when I make my reviews so that it can be a little less my opinion and a little more community feelings about it. And while researching for one of them, I came across a reviewer who wrote out specifically the definition for the autism voice as she sees it. So the first part is the autistic character narrates everything in minute detail. The second is the autistic character narrates emotional experiences and or their emotions in a dispassionate, disconnected way. And 3, moments of high emotion can be recognized by an abundance of verbal tics, like counting repeatedly or saying the same few things over and over and over again rather than just going silent, which is more typical. So now that we know everything that we know that we learned in this video, let's look back at that quote from Curious Incident that I said earlier. There are 19 cows in the field, 15 of which are black and white, and 4 of which are brown and white. That is a village in the distance which has 31 visible houses. Now, hopefully after watching everything that we've just discussed, you can tell that something is fundamentally off. You just feel like something's off, even when it's read by an actually autistic person. Some elements on the surface of this are accurate, but it is missing something. It's missing the life and the energy that autistic speech typically has to it. There's more to it. It's not just straight and flat all the time. It goes all over the place. There's different ways of processing and of speaking. And in fact, the more humanistic portrayals of autistic speech patterns that I can find are in Disney animals and Disney robots. And I don't know how familiar you are with Baymax or Doug or even the body language and just general energy of Toothless from How to Train Your Dragon, but at least in my house, these characters have been adopted as the us characters. We watch those movies for those characters. They're the ones that we quote all the time because they think how we think and they talk how we talk. So while they weren't explicitly written to be autistic or have an autistic voice, they were written to be fundamentally human, but also kind of whimsical and different from the way humans typically speak. Or in the case of characters that don't use words, like Toothless, their body and their body language and the noises that they make to show their meaning. It's kind of in the similar way that autistic people tend to do without words. And on one hand, I really really hate that the best autistic representation we have is usually relegated to robots and animals, because those are problematic things that we need to unpack. But then on the other hand, that's also what makes these characters so lovable and iconic. And because of this, Disney milks as much money from them as they possibly can. And so we get TV shows like Doug Days, which I love and appreciate and would watch 13 times over. I've already seen it 5 times. So I think at the end of all of this, what I have concluded is that there is a very fine line between the stereotypical autism voice that is problematic and the actual real-life autistic voice. And what it comes down to is the intention and the emotion behind it at the end of the day, because a lot of the stereotypes are correct on some level and do happen a little bit in real life, but it's how they're implemented and streamlined that is the problem. And that's a discussion that is going to stop here and be saved for a future video about the best way to write disabled characters, which you will see in precisely a month from now, so stay tuned for that one. But yeah, I hope that you enjoyed learning about the very specific and weird science behind communication differences that categorize autism versus typicality. Not necessarily in the sense that we see the world differently, but in the sense that we express that world differently. And I think that that's pretty interesting. I hope that you did too, and let me know what you think. I want to know what your favorite example of these speech patterns in the media is, or like which one of these things do you do more than others? Are there any things that I missed that you speak in a certain way that I didn't know about on the interwebs? I don't know. Let me know in the comments. I would love to hear from you guys. You're also welcome to subscribe if you want to stick around, but also no pressure. And as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it is never too late to start over, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.